Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. The world is changing, as is the battle space. Emerging technologies such as cyber, lethal autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, additive manufacturing, stealth, synthetic biology, hypersonic vehicles, remote sensing, and distributed ledger technology are all poised to reshape the landscape of international relations. It's unknown territory in most cases. Many technologies may not mature or live up to their hype, but many could and would. And they offer unique challenges. At the heart of the operation of these technologies lies digital integration. They force us to think anew because they open up a wide range of problems. This is the paradox. Just like the pre-digital era and its weapons, in this new age too, what we think makes us secure is also what makes us insecure. But the digital is not just about virtual space. What happens in that space can have physical consequences. A good example is cyber attacks. Such attacks take place regularly even when there's no actual declaration of war in the sense of movement of troops, tanks, fighter jets, etc. Unlike pre-digital military systems that could be kept away from falling in unauthorized hands and whose proliferation could be largely, if not entirely, checked, most emerging technologies are contextually different. They are mass technologies. More and more states and companies are investing in and producing such technologies and capabilities. These technologies, barring some like lethal autonomous weapons or armed drones, may not have distinctly lethal characteristics. They're useful for people as much as they're important for military purposes. In other words, how can they be controlled without disrupting economic activity? In fact, daily life itself. To discuss whether emerging technologies will contribute to strategic stability or become a threshold problem for waging war is our topic of discussion today. And we are joined by Air Chief Marshal Sir Brian Burrage, who's Chief Executive of the Royal Aeronautical Society, and Air Marshal Waseem, who's Director, Center for Aerospace and Strategic Studies. Both join us from Islamabad studios. Thank you to our panelists. Let me begin with Sir Brian here. So, Brian, let's start with the changing nature of air war and the battle space in terms of an integrated ground systems and the birds up in the air. Give us a sense of how that has changed from, let's say, about 25, 30 years ago.
Thank you for having me on the program. The air defense world has changed dramatically over that period of time. The first big change, I suppose, 20 years ago was the ability to integrate radars into the command and control system and to use what were then relatively sophisticated computers in order to aid decision support. And at the same time, indication friend and foe, IFF, was also becoming more sophisticated. So it was possible to get what we termed a recognized air picture. And in complex airspace, that would include the capability, or rather the presence of civilian aircraft and the ability to deconflict. So I guess the first thing that changed was integration. Then gradually radars themselves became A, more reliable, and B, more powerful. And so the capability of the whole system started to change significantly in terms of the discrimination that you could see. And then ultimately, as you get more and more data into any system, then you start to need more powerful computers, you start to need faster communications, and those are the most recent changes, I think, that made a significant effect. And of course, once you reach that level, as you implied in your introduction, then you have to be very clear about how you protect your data and how you protect your system from cyber attack.
Okay, so we're going to come to that as far as troops on the ground are concerned in terms of blockchain technologies and all that. But let's, for now, stick to the air war. So this is now essentially a tug of war, so to speak, between ground air defenses, the aircraft that are supposed to interdict, and the offensive strike package that operates or is supposed to operate in enemy territory. Now, what we are witnessing is this struggle between the aircraft and the radars and sensors on the ground, where the aircraft, the strike package, has to operate in an environment which we normally refer to as suppression of enemy air defense or the destruction of enemy air defense. Now, given technologies such as the S-300 PMU or the upgraded S-400, how does this struggle unfold? I mean, we've heard about S-400 as a system that is very deadly even for the 4th and 4.5 generation aircraft. Give me your sense of how that is going to unfold. And I ask this, and I'm going to take this question to Air Marshal Waseemuddin also, because in our case, in South Asia, India will be getting the S-400 system in a couple of years, and that offers a challenge to Pakistan Air Force. But first to you, Sir Brian, and then I'll take it to Air Marshal Waseemuddin.
Well, I wouldn't underestimate the problem of long-range surface-to-air missiles, but their presence is what has driven many nations into doing stealth technology and also standoff capability. So the first point to make is it's absolutely vital in military operations of any significance that you need to get control of the air. And control of the air includes not only the other side's fighter force, but also their missiles, their command and control system. So you have two choices. The first is that you use stealth aircraft to penetrate the difficult missile engagement zones in order to write down the missiles, or the alternative, which certainly applies in long-range surface-to-air missiles, is to use standoff anti-radiation missiles. And again, as we see technology advancing and we see the prospect of hypersonic weapons, which are very difficult to defeat, then an initial application of those weapons will be in suppression of enemy air defenses, as we say.
Absolutely. Let's take the same question as I said to Air Marshal Waseemuddin. Air Marshal Waseemuddin, sir, give me a sense of how the Pakistan Air Force reads into this threat and the possible responses to it.
I'll just take you a little back. If you recall those times once the surface-to-air missiles and the integrated air defense systems were taking shape, and we, the fighter pilots, were always thinking of the tactics or the equipment to use against them. I take you to Arab-Israel war. Once you see the SAMs which were deployed by the Allied Arab forces were taken out by the Israeli Air Force. So there are systems which can take care of these missiles, and it will be time before these EW systems, or what Sir Brian mentioned, the anti-radiation missiles long range would be developed and would be obtained. However, coming back to S-400 and its deployment in the subcontinent and the South Asia, it is definitely going to, if you see it in a different context, you don't see it as a standalone system, this S-400. It is not a threat only against the aircraft, but is also against the incoming missiles. And once you couple it up with the other technologies and other capabilities which the Indians are striving to have and are being provided by the world powers, so it is going to have a strategic effect. As at the operational level, the Air Force will find ways to counter it, but it is going to give a sense of false safety to the Indian leadership, which could result into a serious arm imbalance and add to their arrogance.
But here's the thing, I'm sure that the Pakistan Air Force would develop the techniques and the tactics to counter this. But in terms of the threat itself, with the Indians getting the Rafales and the S-400, surely the nature of the battle space undergoes a change.
Yeah, you are actually right, exactly right that the battle space will change, especially once they get the Rafale and they get the S-400. But remember, once they had these Russian air defense systems, we found the antidote to that. But what I'm trying to tell you that we will obviously have, this is a live threat, we'll have, the Pakistan Air Force is cognizant of this fact that we have to survive, we have to operate in this kind of environment. We will find tactics which maybe, or find the equipment, right equipment, or we may already be thinking about that. But what I'm taking you to a different side of this deployment, or this acquisition of S-400. It is going to, what I said, this is going to add in the dimension into already the little unstable environment in the South Asian security environment.
So essentially, you say that the threshold is likely to be lower than it should be. But let me go back to Sir Brian. Sir Brian, we talked about the digital integration. We talked about just like the Internet of Things. It's now the integration of Internet of Military Things. The pilot is not the only person in play. There are lots of other people in play, lots of other technologies in play. But with this flow of data and the speed at which decisions have to be made, how do you think, is it getting more difficult to sift through that data? Or is the technology itself sifting through the data? At the end of the day, how much of a role does the human itself is going to play?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, and of course there isn't actually an answer to it. But where we start from, and certainly the way this is viewed in the UK, that with autonomous systems, and be they offensive systems or indeed command and control systems, then having a person in the loop is the current baseline. Now, everybody is aware the technology is accelerating at an enormous pace, particularly driven by commercial requirements, and it is possible to determine, to imagine a situation where the human interaction is kept very much at arm's length, and then subsequently is not required at all because artificial intelligence takes over. Now, that's a very theoretical answer. In fact, in terms of the law of armed conflict, in terms of the ethical use of such weapons, then there is certainly a point at which there has to be an absolute balance between what you're asking your artificial intelligence machine to do and what the human interaction needs to do. And the reason there has to be a balance is because we have to be able to justify, as when we take military action, and let's be clear, military action is nothing more than violence on behalf of a state. So we have to be very clear that that's used, and we can demonstrate it both nationally to our own politicians and to our own electorates, and internationally, not only to other countries, but to the United Nations, for example, that what we do is lawful and also ethical. And so my personal view is that there is a limit to the degree to which we can hand over to artificial intelligence systems. There's also an issue to be explored, because you and those who watch this program will know that artificial intelligence relies on having access to large numbers of data sets, and the sanctity of that data, the degree to which it is structured data, the degree to which you can protect it and make it secure, is an important aspect of the vulnerability of those systems. So, as is so often the case with technology, there may just be the time where the human eye can detect when something is going wrong. So I think we're pretty clear that whilst ever we seek to apply military force legally in line with international law, then there will be a human very close to the loop.
Now, obviously, there are a number of points on the table, and each point requires a long discussion. But let me just sift through this. The thing about the ethical and the legal normative side of it is that law always follows the technology. Now, you cannot have laws, you cannot have ethical questions unless there is something already there. For instance, the nuclear weapons is one such case. If there were no nuclear weapons, we could not have had the legal, normative, coercive framework that followed the nuclear weapons. Ditto for these emerging technologies. And the problem is that many of these technologies, we are, we're working on them, but their employment, the implication of their employment, are still questions about which we are largely in the dark. So this offers a unique problem because many of these technologies are actually everyday technology in the hand of civilians, Internet of Things, artificial narrow intelligence, a part of smart homes, smart buildings. So this is what, I would say what Fred Kaplan called the dark territory. So give me a sense of whether there is an ongoing discussion about these things in the UK, for instance, and elsewhere in Western Europe.
Yes, very definitely. And the new paradigm is what we term fighting in the grey space. This is sub-threshold intervention using advanced technology, social media, which is hard to detect the source of. It's therefore very hard to attribute to a particular entity, be it state or non-state. It can vary from, at the one end, fake news and the regeneration of that using remote capabilities, right the way through to low-level military violence, which is clouded by the way in which it's delivered. And the point here is that unlike hardware, unlike the sort of hardware you see in a military parade, the application or ownership of artificial intelligence systems, of the type of capability that you use in the grey space is invisible. And so the degree to which you could say, well, you have a deterrent effect by your conventional capability is now being diluted. And that's a very, very difficult area to be in. And excuse me, maybe we'll talk in a moment about how we deal with that internationally, but that is a fact. You're quite right. We've entered a new paradigm.
Absolutely, we need a new paradigm. Back to Air Marshal Waseemuddin. Air Marshal Waseemuddin, we normally think that these emerging technologies is not really our short-term problem, given our resource constraints and also the fact that this is something which is, the R&D is going on in the West and also in the East, in China, in Southeast Asia, Far East. But this is something that is going to come here sooner or later. Now, do we have a discussion here in terms of the strategic stability problems? I talked about the threshold problem because many of these technologies actually bring in that threshold problem in terms of lowering the threshold for actually going into undeclared wars. As I said, cyber attacks are a daily occurrence. But the security threat, the strategic stability problem, the threshold problem, the problem of legal and ethical questions, are we discussing them?
Yes, you're right. What the emerging technologies are doing to the world, they're dividing into have and have-nots. The debate in the West may be different, but debate in our part of the world, maybe like you said, that we may not have access to all those kind of technologies. But if you see, they're adding a lot of instability to our region, or have the capability to add instability to our region because of their easy availability, because of their, like you said, easy use, easy availability, cheaper to acquire, and they can always, in the hands of, let's say, non-state actors, or they can add to the instability. As far as we are concerned, there is a debate, and the current our seminar, G-Star, which is arranged by the CAS, is a step to that direction, because we are also, a session is dedicated to the effects of the emerging technologies, and another session is dedicated to the new kind of warfare. So this will, I agree to the question, your initial question, that this is going to add to the instability in our subcontinent.
Okay. Before I wrap up this segment, let me quickly go back to Air Chief Marshal Sir Brian Burrage. Sir Brian, here's the scenario. The emerging technologies, we don't really know much about them. I talked about artificial general intelligence is an area which is rife with all sorts of speculations, and also ethical and moral questions in terms of how those machines with artificial general intelligence actually behave. And in this environment, a lot of what is happening seems to be non-kinetic. You know, keyboard being a great leveler as just an example of that. And these non-kinetic fake news, social media, and various other things that you talked about also have kinetic, they can have kinetic results. They can be employed in support of kinetic action. But a lot of this is also happening, in terms of undeclared war. Whether it's the NSA and the US, whether it's the Russian hackers, whether it's the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Israelis, this is happening on a daily basis. So are we already, or have we already entered that space where this war is now on?
The boundary has just changed. And the first point is the technologies that you talked about have their roots in commercial technology. And so proliferation of those technologies is in many ways limitless, because they are freely available almost off the shelf. The degree to which, and that's a good thing and a bad thing, because it means that, yes, they spread into all sorts of non-state actors potentially, or state actors who are presenting themselves as non-state actors. But also it means a nation like Pakistan can embrace these technologies, because you have the advantage where you have smart people, you have a great education system, good technical capability, and for example, the use of artificial intelligence is merely about having the right algorithms to treat the data that you want to treat. And that's something that goes on in commercial life here in Pakistan. So whereas you're right, we now have this blurred boundary, we have to deal with it in exactly the same way as we would any other threat. And do remember, threat is a combination of capability and intentions. And so if a state, for example, wants to use these sorts of capabilities below the threshold, in a sense, they will get caught, because this is a global joined up world, and allies will come together. And going back to my point, this is one of the fundamental aspects of controlling the use of such technologies, because ultimately, when people are trying to use it covertly and they're found out, we have to apply sanctions. And one of the most powerful abilities that the United Nations have is to bring nations together to apply sanctions to a nation that is behaving badly. And it was interesting that I felt that view for a long time. It came out in yesterday's conference, not by me, that in this era of advanced technologies used in this way, we need a stronger United Nations.
We need a stronger United. That's a topic which requires a separate program, but thank you so much. That was Air Chief Marshal Sir Brian Burrage and Air Marshal Waseem. Thank you to both the panelists. We shall take a short break and continue with our discussion of emerging technologies. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. In addition to the problems we discussed in the first part of the program, two other issues are very important, especially in relation to stability. One, the legal and the normative follow the emerging technologies. You cannot have a legal framework for something that did not exist. It is only when some technology emerges and is employed that we can fully figure out how it will or is impacting us. There could have been no nuclear weapons-related legal and treaty frameworks without nuclear weapons having come into play. Second, historically and empirically, technology begins to drive strategy, and strategy in turn pressures the scientific community to deliver more. Ralph Lapp, a nuclear physicist involved with the Manhattan Project, discussed this problem clearly in his book, Arms Beyond Doubt, Tyranny of Weapons Technology. The digital world and its impact on war offers these challenges. Wassenaar Arrangement, formed in 1996, seeks to promote transparency and greater responsibility in transfers of conventional arms and dual-use goods and technologies. The Wassenaar Arrangement attempts to ensure that transfers of these items do not contribute to the development or enhancement of military capabilities which undermine the goal. It has a control list that details items and technologies that fall within the WA purview. However, as we move further down, or shall I say up, the digital track, such arrangements will come under new pressures. To discuss the issue at hand further, we are now joined by Luigi Paganini, who is Chief Technology Officer at Sybase and member European Union Agency for Cyber Security, and Matt Sheehan, who is a fellow at the Paulson Institute's think tank Marco Polo, where he leads the team's research on the US-China technology relationship. Thank you to both panelists. Let me go to Mr. Paganini here. Mr. Paganini, we were discussing, before you joined us, the problem that I just mentioned in my opening, which has to deal with, how do we look at the moral, legal, and ethical issues in terms of technologies that are emerging, that are being developed. We really do not know how, in various ways, we're going to employ them and what will be the implication of that employment. Give me a sense of how you look at this emerging landscape.
Of course. Well, first of all, we have to say that emerging technologies have a significant impact on regional crisis stabilities. So let's consider that almost every government is currently investing in improving in technological capabilities, especially cyber capabilities, from both offensive and defensive perspective. And almost every day, I can tell you that the malware intelligence experts in my company monitor an impressive number of hacking campaigns aimed at espionage and sabotage. But another aspect that you have to consider that any emerging technology is influenced by the ability to gather necessary data in the proper time frame. In this context, I believe that we need a global legal framework, but it's another challenge. I was one of the members of the Italian group at G7 in 2017. And in that meeting, we discussed, we prepared a set of norms of state behavior in the cyberspace. The problem is that it's difficult to ask to states to accept this kind of norms because some states are more advanced than others, some states are invested more than other states, and so they want to maintain these leaderships in this sense. But anyway, as you mentioned it before, we need a global legal framework. I have worked with the G7 countries, but I need that this kind of discussion must include many other governments worldwide, because without a legal framework, we always face problems that are related to the abuse of this kind of technologies.
Okay, now here's the issue. A lot of these technologies are basically commercial civilian technologies. There was a time when war was kind of declared in the sense that one adversary, if he wanted to pick a fight, would obviously mobilize. Mobilization meant military hardware. You could see the movement of army vehicles, tanks, artillery, the forward basing of aircraft and the rest of it, and you could see that the intentions are changing. But here we now have a threshold problem, because every day there is cyber war going on, cyber attacks going on the Russian hackers getting into the American system, the Americans getting into the Russian system, the Chinese system. It's like a network. It's like a web that's out there. So do we now face a threshold problem, that the threshold for this kind of war is now extremely low and it is undeclared?
The problem is that we are in the middle of a cyber war. Every day, our companies, our society works in the cyberspace. The cyberspace is a space without boundaries. Okay, this means that every attacker could hit in any times from any places. And in many cases, we observe also some false flag operation, proxy attacks. This means basically that almost every government and also cyber criminal syndicates are using the cyberspace to carry out their operation. And it's important to transfer this concept to the people. Every day we go in our banks and we access to our accounts. We are able to withdraw money, but it's behind these simple activities, there is a huge work of intelligence experts and cybersecurity experts that attempt to defend the critical infrastructure of every government. Critical infrastructure are the main targets of this kind of silent war. But I can tell you that we are assisting at an explosion of the number of attacks. Every day, almost every country is working to attempt to steal sensitive information, secret data, and it's not something that is starting this year or yesterday. It's something that has started a decade ago. So this means that some actors are very advanced. In many cases, some threat actors remained under the radar for many years. This means they had the abilities to steal sensitive information. They had the abilities to sabotage also specific implants. So we must be concerned by this kind of activity, and we need to cooperate to share information about emerging threats because it's the unique way to mitigate the risk posed by the exposure to these threats.
Okay, let me go to Matt Sheehan. Mr. Sheehan, you work in a very interesting area, US-China technology relationship. In fact, you have authored a book called The Trans-Pacific Experiment, How China and California Collaborate and Compete for Our Future. Now, I say that this is a very interesting area because given the overall sort of geopolitical approach of China as an emerging power and the US as the existing dominant power, there is obviously, the relationship is now very tense. And I would refer specifically to what the Trump administration has said about Huawei. As a matter of fact, President Trump himself, on a number of occasions, is now on record as having warned the American allies to stay away from Huawei's 5G technology. So give me a sense of how you look at this situation.
So speaking more broadly about the US-China technology relationship first, I think right now we're at a moment of almost historic level friction, specifically when it comes to technology. But this is coming very soon after a period at which we saw deep integration between the private sector technology ecosystems in both countries. For much of the past decade, from say 2008 to 2018, you had greater integration and greater flows of people, money, and capital between the two countries. You had Chinese engineers coming to Silicon Valley, you had Silicon Valley companies setting up research labs in Beijing, and you had this integration coming at all levels. And what we're seeing in the past couple of years is the attempt to wrench apart these ecosystems. In many ways, China had decoupled much of its technology ecosystem from the US for some time by blocking American companies like Google and Facebook. But the US hadn't reciprocated in blocking Chinese companies. And at these more grassroots level, people, money, ideas, the intellectual community was still very rich and constantly moving back and forth. Right now, what we're seeing is this kind of in some cases systematic, in some cases haphazard attempt to cut these ties at every level, to cut off the flows of money between the places, to cut off the flows of people between the places, and in the case of Huawei, to cut off the flows of the actual technology, both the physical technology and the ideas that underlie it. So this is the real tension here comes from trying to pull apart two ecosystems that were in so many ways deeply integrated, and then, as you spoke to, forcing other countries, forcing allies, or attempting to force countries like India or Pakistan to sort of choose sides in this conflict. And I think that's a very live question that no matter how much the US or the Trump administration kind of bangs the table and tells everyone to stay away from Huawei, it's a very open question whether they will.
Okay, so you talked about the integration of these ecosystems, and of course, when we look at the digital world, we're talking about a world which is now becoming a global ecosystem. But given what's happening that we just talked about, do you think that we are now, the states are moving towards sort of, these separate ecosystems or blocks, shall I say, just like the geopolitical blocks that we see in a multipolar world?
That's definitely the direction that governments are pushing in. I think you see a lot of resistance to that movement here. I'm based in Oakland, California, close to Silicon Valley. And if you talk to technologists here or researchers, especially in my area of artificial intelligence, there's a lot of resistance and a lot of pushback to this idea that you can just sort of pull the ecosystems apart. So that's at sort of a person-to-person or a researcher-to-researcher level. At the national level, you see, once again, while the US and China are making this push for decoupling and disentanglement, a lot of countries that are sort of caught between those two ecosystems are very hesitant to commit to one side or the other. They might find certain benefits from working with Chinese companies like Huawei, which offer far cheaper subsidized 5G infrastructure, but at the same time, they want full access, of course, to Google. They still want their talented youth to go study at American universities and come back. So I think while there's a major push in the national governments in the US and China for this disentanglement and decoupling, there's resistance both at the sort of grassroots level here in the US and in China, and also resistance at the national government level in a lot of other countries.
Okay, one more question before I go back to Mr. Paganini, since you work in the area of artificial intelligence. Give us a sense of course, the artificial narrow intelligence is already in play. We've got smart homes, smart buildings, smart cities. But then there is the issue of the artificial general intelligence, where people actually working in the AGI area have raised a number of questions. I remember there was a letter that was written by about 70 or 75 people, entrepreneurs, investors, and the researchers in the area. It was, if I remember correctly, in 2017, including signed by Elon Musk, which called upon governments to stop research and development in artificial general intelligence forthwith. So just give us, a sense of how this area is unfolding.
Sure. This is the question of AGI, of artificial general intelligence, is maybe one of the most divisive questions within the artificial intelligence community. Divisive in the sense of Are we close to that, or is it still a far distant dream that divides a lot of very senior technologists and researchers? And then the question of what would happen if we as researchers or we as a human community were to achieve artificial general intelligence? Would that be a good thing, put to good use, or would that be a bad thing? And so when the research community is in many ways so divided on that, it can become especially hard to communicate effectively what the policy prescriptions are to governments and actors like that. And of course, there is an immense problem in terms of a security dilemma for governments. If you believe that that any rival government or even an ally has the possibility of attaining AGI, artificial general intelligence, there's a huge incentive to push your own researchers to attain that. And in many ways, the most dangerous thing is not necessarily do we achieve it or do we not, but do we achieve it with proper safety guards in place, or out of this fear of a race of coming in second, of the US losing to China or vice versa? Does that fear push the researchers and governments to disregard safety protocols and potentially lead to catastrophic consequences?
Absolutely. Mr. Paganini, let me pick up the point that Mr. Sheehan is making, and I think this is a point that we have seen throughout history in terms of weapons development. The state's coercive apparatus, the militaries are always very interested in acquiring technologies that give them an upper hand on the adversary. Now, multiple states and also large companies are developing these technologies. And it seems to me that this is a competition. Since we talked about the moral, legal, ethical questions, it seems to me that this is a competition where, for reasons of state and for reasons of state interests, for geopolitical reasons, the states are not going to allow themselves to be bound by any new rules. Do you also get this sense?
I totally share your point of view. Basically, government don't want to put any limits to their abilities to acquire information, to acquire technologies, and so on. Anyway, we have to consider that from cybersecurity perspective, it's essential to develop the ability to analyze any kind of technology. I believe that in this phase of the evolution, we cannot stop the adoption of some technologies. Let me say, for example, artificial intelligence or quantum computing, that I believe are the most dangerous technologies if they will be abused. But anyway, we have to develop the ability to qualify the hardware and the software. This is the main issues that is discussed by any Western organization. We cannot completely close, for example, capital and technology that comes from China and other countries, but we must be able to analyze what they are putting in our house. This means that we have to develop the ability to analyze hardware and software in the attempt, for example, to find any kind of vector and so on. Without the ability of qualify hardware and software, we are really in danger. And another aspect to consider that is very important, that the global economy is running and technology is pushing this global growth. So for any government, it is essential to be to sit in the table of the big companies of the big countries, and it's important for any country to provide technology, cutting-edge technologies. So the message is we must be able to qualify any kind of solution, hardware and software.
Okay, back to Sheehan. Mr. Sheehan, there was a sense with digital the World Wide Web, the social media and the rest of it, there was a sense that this is going to be a lot of freedom of expression and opinion for societies. But now we realize that these technologies are being used by states to actually monitor, surveil civil societies. They are being used by certain dictatorial states for social experimentation in terms of, it's almost like, to give the example, it's like Huxley's Brave New World. Now, how do you look at the situation? Is this going to give us freedoms, or is this going to make the states even more controlling of societies?
I think it's pretty clear that what a technology like artificial intelligence, which is, I think, central to a lot of what you're describing about surveillance and control, a technology like that clearly increases the capabilities of a government when it comes to not just information control, but of course, population control. Essentially what you're able to do is to take millions of hours of human labor out of the equation and allow for real-time monitoring of at a scale that has just never been possible before. And I'm sure there will be sort of countercurrents and stuff like that, but at the most basic level, I think it's hard to imagine this being more freedom-giving rather than freedom-taking away. I think there are some promising avenues of research in machine learning that look more to protect privacy and to guard against this. One area is called federated learning. It has to do with the way in which data is shared between, say, a device like a cell phone and a server where the actual learning on the data might happen. And so this is an area where researchers have, I think, woken up to it. Maybe you'd say woken up too late in the case of certain technologies like computer vision and facial recognition. But there is going to be now something of a technological push, especially coming out of places like Silicon Valley, to sort of fight back and claw back some of that privacy. But it's something that happens very unevenly, and that is in the same way that you described the governance on an international scale lagging far behind the technology or not being possible until the technology is there. Even the awareness of this issue has lagged far behind, and I think we're kind of just now in the waking up phase, and it's going to be a very difficult piece of technology to put back in the box when it comes to infringements on privacy and attempts to control large populations. Absolutely.
We are indeed in a dark territory, an unknown territory. Thank you so much, Luigi, Paganini, Matt Sheehan. This is all for tonight from Indus Special. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.